Hi there, my name's Ed, and last month I made the savage mistake of releasing a video about contemporary politics. I responded appropriately.
I need a drink.
But while I was dranking my drunk, a thought came to me.
Hang on, this tastes like lynx piss.
Why might that be? Let's look into it, with the help of one bloke who inspired The Matrix, another bloke who didn't, and obviously some men with beards standing next to some big barrels. So welcome to this video essay on craft beer, consumer culture, and the very nature of language itself.
Oh, well, of course you must have vegetables!
A couple of years ago, that supermarket your mum likes, known to me and you as Aldi, released a beer called the Anti-Establishment IPA. The beer, with its blue packaging, bold font, and ever so slightly edgy theme, was clearly doing an impression of Brewdog's Punk IPA. Aldi was impersonating the biggest craft brewery in the country. Now, Punk IPA was the beer that shot Brewdog to nationwide fame, after winning a craft beer competition run by Tesco that saw the bluish bottles stacked onto the shelves in 500 stores. It's Brewdog's flagship beer. It's their identity, for Christ's sakes. And Aldi was stocking this beer on the same shelves as their imitation. I guess you could say they were having their caterpillar cake and eating it too. So Brewdog and its outspoken co-founders James Watt and Martin Dickey got a bit worked up that their whole punk brand was being imitated by a discount supermarket. They got worked up on Twitter, issued a pithy press release, and then, apropos of nothing, launched a new beer available exclusively at Aldi called the Old IPA. Aldi PA? Aldipa? Can we get a linguist in here, please? And Brewdog were really taking the cake with this one. They designed the can to match the colours of Aldi's branding and called it an own label IPA. It was all a bit of tongue-in-cheek marketing, really. A social media scuffle that boiled over into the glass. I hope you liked that little anecdote about craft beer, but what you might not have noticed was that I told it without making a single reference to the actual beer in the actual can. That entire conversation was about branding. A feud fought around the stuff outside the beer can, as opposed to its intoxicating contents. And it's worth mentioning that, appearances aside, Punk and Anti-Establishment are completely different IPAs, in that one of them is uniquely terrible. You see, Aldi could sell this bargain basement bev without wondering about whether punters would care about its oily body or overbearing bitterness. Odds are they're not buying it because of what's inside the can. Drink a few and you'll stop telling the difference anyway.
Nice.
No, they're buying it because of what's outside the can. Because they recognise Brewdog's hallmarks as a mark of quality. This was a punk-ish independent brewing ethos being exuded by a multinational company with an annual global turnover of £65 billion, aping Brewdog and profiting from the monkey business. Before we delve into the big philosophical questions, I feel like I need to define what craft beer is, or at least what I think craft beer is, because it's one of those things that defies definition, like true love, or authentic pasta carbonara. So I'm drawing on a veritable beverage expert. In his recent book, Craft: An Argument, beer writer Pete Brown lays down how the beer industry applies the word craft in a wildly different way to the wider craft movement of independent small producers. Brown argues that craft beer can't just be independent, because that would include a bunch of insipid lagers. And it can't just be small batch, because that would exclude the now vast enterprise of Brewdog, for example. The history of craft generally is artisanal, whether it's in architecture, fashion, or your old Dar's best bitter. And artisanal simply means something that's had care, thought, and personality put into it. It's obvious that this excludes the likes of what Brewdog disdainfully calls industrial lager. But how do we sort through the rest? And why do we need to? Well, the other day I bought a crate of craft beer. I got 36 beers for £36. Bargain, I thought. That's less than you pay for Corona down the local. But these beers aren't half as sophisticated as they look. They're all the same style, cheap hops in meagre quantities, and apart from one or two exceptions, they all clock in at around about 4% ABV. This is in sharp contrast to the hot bomb high alcohol trend of US style craft beers that have filtered into UK markets since the noughties. Beers like Sierra Nevada or Lagunitas IPA that we're lucky enough to take for granted on supermarket shelves. These cheaper craft beers might be independent and small batch, but the only other thing they have in common with those top-notch American beers is how they choose to sell themselves. Look at this can! It's loaded with the stylistic trends you see on craft cans worldwide. But if I'm honest, it tastes like an Alco Pop that's been scraped off a pub floor somewhere just outside Swindon. And it's not the only beer that's exaggerating on the can. Multiple online craft beer sellers are flogging cans at bargain basement prices, using exactly this trick of lower ABVs and boring flavours covered up with fancy labels. Meanwhile, brewers themselves have grown adept at producing cheaper tipples with broader appeal that are fit for the supermarket to sit alongside their proper range. And of course, the supermarkets themselves have started playing the game, developing their own imitation craft beers in cahoots with bigger breweries. Beer writers, reviewers, and even YouTubers are starting to get wise to all of this, and they're not happy about it, that's for sure. They're not happy because the nature of the product is different to the nature of the packaging, and to find out why, we'll need to start messing about with the nature of language. So put that Alco Pop back where it came from, and let's get down to it. Before we go any further, we'll need to make sure that we're clear on the difference between product and packaging. And to do that, we'll need a hefty dose of structuralism. That is, a method of analysis which treats all cultural phenomena as systems of signs based on the model of language. The history of structuralism lies in linguistics, which I could have used earlier. For example, water is the sign or signifier assigned to this wet object here, also called the signified. In the context of our beer, we could say that the equally wet object inside the can is the signified, and the packaging, its name, its characteristics, is the signifier. Then came post-structuralism, which questioned the assumptions of this model, and the idea that any system we dare to dream up is bound to be dependent on the structures around it. Any system, after all, is defined by how it relates to other systems, the gaps in its vision of the world. One thinker who took this idea a bit further was Jean Baudrillard. God, I hope I did that correctly. He proposed that meaning was brought about through systems of signs working together, and that meaning could only be created through this difference. Water means water because it is not air or not earth. Baudrillard further argued that the object's characteristics were actually reliant on their references to others. Water can only be wet because Earth is dry. This theory was a novel conception of structuralism when it was first put together, and Baudrillard spun it into a wider theory. He wrote that there are 4 ways, or logics, to consider the value of an object, as follows. First, the functional value, or use value, the thing the object does for you, its purpose. For example, this lynx piss is supposed to be drinkable. Second, the exchange value, an object's value in the economic system. For example, a £3 pint compared to a £6 pint. Thirdly, the symbolic value, an object's value assigned by a subject in relation to another subject. For example, buying a friend a pint on their birthday. And finally, the sign value, an object's value within a system of objects. Now, this is the touchy one. It's all about the craft, the status of the object in relation to others, its assigned characteristics or signifiers. Baudrillard argued that the sign value, in the Western context of commercialization, global competition, and advertising, was likely to be privileged at the expense of exchange and especially use value. Advertising in particular, with marketing buzzwords and images taken as representations of a commodity and its effects, was an entire industry run on generating signifiers. Baudrillard went on to suggest that this actually distanced us from reality. He argued that because we tend to understand objects based on signifiers, that means that the signified, the object itself, is always slightly out of reach. A signifier, reliant on commercialization and the rules of the market, can blur away the original use. The world of signs was also considered by Marcuse. In his breakout hit of the summer, One-Dimensional Man, Marcuse used post-structuralist theory to analyse modern consumer society. Marcuse saw that in societies based on mass production and mass distribution, the individual worker had become little more than a consumer of commodities, and modern capitalism had created false needs to encourage this consumption. People began to identify with the signifiers of the commodities they were purchasing. As Marcuse put it, the people recognise themselves in their commodities. They find their soul in their automobile, hi-fi set, split-level home, kitchen equipment. The very mechanism which ties the individual to his society has changed, and social control is anchored in the new needs which it has produced. Marcuse also spoke about art under capitalism, how the absorbent power of society depletes the artistic dimension by assimilating its antagonistic contents. I take this to mean that Marcuse sees the art integrated in capitalism, the sort of stuff you see in galleries and shops, as capitulating to the spectrum of ideas society allows. Art cannot truly transgress, because all potentially transgressive ideas are integrated into capitalism and pacified, so that regardless of how people identify, there is a commodity they can purchase, with a signifier matching their identification. Just look to the greenwashing and pinkwashing trends in corporate communications. But why could corporations get away with these false identifications to begin with? Think for a moment about how, in contemporary society, we use words like democracy, freedom, opportunity, and so on. I'm sure you'll agree these words are frequently abused by politicians, demoted to simple buzzwords that don't even mean anything. But what if these words are actually working to plaster over the context in which they're applied? Now, think about Brexit for a moment. Sorry, I know. I hope we can agree that there was a lot of talk during the referendum campaign all about the will of the people, taking back control, and so on and so forth.
1 month to go, folks, until we take back democracy and take back control for our country. Now, can we do it?
This in spite of the fact that the UK's decision-making power, at an international level at least, actually decreased upon leaving the admittedly imperfect European Union. But the use of democratic language, that will of the people, changed the perception. As Marcuse put it, the noun governs the sentence. The signifier, will of the people, taking back control, overrules the signified, the actual political change attached to such rhetoric. Marcuse called this the authoritarian ritualization of language. The same logic could be applied to commodities and the marketing they employ on their packaging. So when a beer says it's punk, when a beer ostensibly rails against the system, well, you still bought it in the same market for goods on which you'd buy Corona or any other industrial lager. The scope for the beer to actually transgress, to change the system, is locked off because it still has to sell itself on the market, where the beer's signifiers are judged against all others. The market governs the product, the noun governs the sentence. Putting together Baudrillard's understanding of systems and Marcuse's understanding of consumer culture, we can diagnose Western society as one where the human label given to objects is being prioritised, just as its meaning is being ripped away. So given this priority for signifier over signified, a bog standard ale with a great label can sell like hotcakes. And at the other end of the spectrum, a spectacular ale can get lost behind a plain label. You might be wondering why I'm singling out craft beer for this, given that every industry has its marketing tropes and coded buzzwords. It's all in the history, really. You see, in the period after the 2008 financial crash, craft brewing took off like never before. There are almost 4 times as many brewers in the UK now as there were at the turn of the millennium. And the same trend applies to craft coffee, craft jewellery, and whatever the hell this is. Part of the reason was that people who used to work in financially lucrative but unfulfilling careers like banking or accountancy flew off the handle post-2008 to pursue their passions, having realised the fragility of the system. This was actually acknowledged by Pete Brown in another book of his, implying that craft brewing was another accidental, gentrifying middle-class habit. This links back to Marcuse's assertions about commodity signifiers as sources of identity.
Bottle opener? Don't need one.
The middle class, with their excess income, have greater access to commodities that they use to express themselves, to make a statement about their status using signifiers. Of course, every market has its statement products. But compared to other commodities, there's little scope to, for example, tailor a craft beer to benefit developing economies, like you might do with a coffee, or pursue sustainable industrial practices, like you could do with jewellery. You see, beer is overwhelmingly, even now, made with just 4 ingredients: hops, grains, yeast, and water. All those ingredients are abundant in the Western world, and the difference from beer to beer can actually be surprisingly minor. So the statement, the identity content in the signifier, rarely extends beyond the narrative of the individual manufacturer, and has little to do with the object they manufacture. Craft beer is, in this respect, an incubator for the priority of signifiers, which is why it's not surprising that Pete Brown's latest book is actually all about craft beer labels. So why did I buy this cheap craft beer? Maybe I bought it despite myself. To spite myself. Because I hate myself and I'm worried that nothing means anything anymore? Maybe I'd have bought it even if the makers were called Goebbels Brewery and the beer was called Chernobyl Was a Good Thing, even if it said the taste was spatchcocked and perverse. Maybe I bought it because that's punk? Is that punk? Or I'm punk? I'm lost between signifiers that never quite give meaning. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why does any of this matter? Well, look, craft beer isn't the only example of this change in society. It's just an exaggerated example within a broader shift. A shift away from defining objects based on what they mean to you, use value, what they mean to others, exchange value, or what they mean between people, symbolic value, towards what they mean as part of the system, where choices are made not based on quality, but prestige, or better put, significance. And when we talk about that system, we have to ask who's controlling it, who runs the noun that governs the sentence. Marcuse could only make one suggestion to solve the issues he highlighted in One Dimensional Man. It was called the Great Refusal. Marcuse never gave a clear indication of how exactly one would perform it, except that it was the protest against that which is. The protest against not just industrial lager, but industry. Not just against flaws in the system, but the entire system that precludes such flaws. The only way to challenge a world where everything it produces colours our perceptions is to reject everything it produces, to live entirely outside the system. Marcuse seemed to concede that this was almost impossible, counterintuitive even. But he also seemed to suggest that if enough people understood the essential nature of the Great Refusal, then it might just be possible to enact it. And if this abysmal ale can help you see why the entire system is at least a little spatchcocked, and more than a little perverse, maybe that's a step in the right direction.